Hello, I'm Doug Watches. Welcome to the Locksmith DVD training program. The subject of this course is how to impression a key to fit a lock. Impressioning is the process of filing a key to fit a lock without having the use of a working key to study. Of all the skills needed by a locksmith, this one might be considered the most difficult to master. With practice, however, anyone can do it. Mastering this technique will greatly increase your abilities as a locksmith and allow you a range of solutions that would not otherwise be available to you. Impressioning is of great benefit in automotive locksmithing, but it also has application in many other areas. After completing this course, you should be able to list the basic tools used in impressioning a key, explain the process of impressioning a key, explain 3 different methods of making impression marks. Explain where to find space and depth data. Give the depth increments of cuts used in the Yale disc locks, Chicago disc locks, and National disc locks. Explain the process of sight reading a disc or wafer lock. Explain how to prepare a key blank for impressioning. Recognize impression marks. This course is divided into 7 parts. Part 1 is tools. Part 2 is an explanation of impressioning. Part 3 is impressioning demo for a disc or wafer lock. Part 4 is practice with impressioning marks. Part 5 is sight reading a disc lock. Part 6 is impressioning a pin tumbler lock. And Part 7 is review and practice. Now, as far as tools, the main things that you need really are a pair of vice grips and a file, a round file. And the most common type of file used in impressioning is a number 4 Swiss pattern file. So if you really had only these 2 tools, you could impression the keys for many locks. You may also want to use a pippin file. A pippin file is a teardrop shaped file, and many locksmiths prefer this file over the round file. You could try either one and decide which you like. You may also want some rougher cut files, a flat file, maybe a rougher round file. Triangular file may come in handy occasionally. But the main one you need is something to make the impressioning marks, and I'll talk more about that later. Like I said, this is the number 4 Swiss pattern file. And then, of course, as I said, the vice grips, and then have a magnifying glass. And I have a couple different types of magnifying glasses that I normally use. A digital caliper, which comes in very handy. If you have the old-fashioned dial caliper, of course, you can use that. But the price on the digital calipers is down so low, recommend that you try to pick up one of those. Now, in addition to that, we're going to need some key blanks. And what I suggest you do is go through your inventory of key blanks and get all of the small key blanks so that we can pick out one that'll work in the smaller locks. If it's a larger lock, you can normally identify the keyway and get the correct key blank for it. Some of the cam locks and smaller locks and so on, they're more difficult to identify, and it helps to have a little collection of small key blanks. Now, as far as key blanks, soft brass is the best. So when you're buying key blanks for impressioning, try to pick up soft brass key blanks. Now, another tool that you may be interested in is a handle or a holder for the key blank while you're impressioning it. There's a number of companies that make these. This one is made by ProLock. Some locksmiths think that it's a lot better to have the holder that allows them to keep the key more straight in line with the lock. Personally, I don't see a lot of difference. You might want to get one and try it. But the way this works, you simply put the key blank in, and then there's 2 set screws here that you tighten up to hold the key blank while you're impressioning it. So that's another tool that you may be interested in looking at. Now, in addition to those tools, of course, you're going to need a vise, and it'd be helpful to have an impressioning plate. This particular plate is made by Keydex. And as far as doing cam locks, it has you can put the lock in. You see these different holes for different locks. This is for an older Ford lock, older Chrysler, Toyota, and Datsun, and so on. but it has a hole for the traditional size cam locks. So this comes in very handy. You can just put the cam lock into the plate, or whatever lock it is you have that you're working on. If it'll fit in the plate, then you just put the plate in the vise and it holds it very securely so you can impression the lock. I would like to just briefly talk about the process of impressioning a key to fit a lock, and what happens when we say we are going to take a key blank and make it fit a lock. We simply take the key blank, insert it into the lock, twist it a little bit against the tumblers and bind it, and make impressions on the top of the key blank. We then file down the impressions, reinsert the blank back into the lock, try to get more impressions, and when we get the cuts deep enough, the lock should work. Now, to do that, we need a very fine file, and the reason for this is it will help us to get the impressions. We clean the top of the key blank, and as we do that, using a fine file, it will leave tiny little ridges on the top of the blank, or little file marks. Well, when we insert the blank into the lock and bind it against the tumblers, it will smash these little file marks down and make little impressions. And then we can file those impressions, and as I said, finally we'll get a working key. So that's the process. That's why it's important to have a very fine file to do this kind of work with. You'll also find it helpful to have a very bright light. As you get the marks on the key blank and you roll it back and forth in front of a bright light, it's much easier to see the marks on the blank. There are three basic ways to try to get the impression marks on a key blank. We turn the key blank and bind it against the tumblers and rock it. Then we can turn it the other direction and bind it and rock it. And we can do that a few times and try to get the impression marks. That's one method. Now, a second method to get impression marks on the key blank is called bumping. We put the key blank into the lock that we're trying to impression. We take a rod, put it through the hole in the key blank, turn the key blank with the rod, putting pressure on the key blank. Take a mallet and then bump the key. You can bump it from both the top and the bottom. Usually just a couple of times. If it's going to make an impression mark like that, it'll do it the first or second time. You don't have to bump it a lot. If it's going to do it, that should do it. So that's a second method to get the impression marks. The third method to get impression marks on the key blank is to do what's called extracting, where we use something to put pressure to pull the key outward. We turn the key blank and we bind it against the tumblers, and then the way I do it, I use a screwdriver and force the key out a little bit, just kind of pull the key back out of the lock. And then you can turn it the other way and do the same thing and force the key blank back out of the lock while it's bound against the tumblers. Now, you cannot do this in a disc or wafer tumbler lock. That'll bend the wafers in the lock. So this is only used on pin tumbler locks. But that is a third way to try to get the impression marks. And as we go through the course, I'll talk about all of these different methods more. Impressioning is a method of fitting a key to a lock without taking the lock apart. Impressioning requires a key blank, a pair of locking pliers or a key blank handle, and a fine-cut file. Impressioning involves binding a key blank against the tumblers and applying force to the key blank to make impression marks. There are three basic methods of applying force to the blank to make the impression marks: rocking, bumping, and extracting. Do not use the extracting method of impressioning on disc or wafer locks, as it can damage the wafers. To impression a key, use a number 4 Swiss round pattern file or a fine-cut pippin file. Use light pressure on the forward stroke only. Lift the file on the back stroke. Use a flat file or pippin file to shape the sides of the cut. For our first project, we are going to impression the key for a disc or wafer lock. The disc lock is very common and can be found on office furniture, home cabinets, and even in automobiles. If you do not have one around your house, you can purchase an inexpensive one at your local building supply store. Also, pick up a few key blanks to practice with. Both locks and key blanks are easily obtained today from the internet. Now, when you're going to impression a lock, you want to approach it much the same way as if you're going to pick the lock. You want to examine the lock, find out what you can about the lock. You want to make sure all of the wafers or tumblers are moving freely in the lock. There's no trash in the lock, that kind of thing. So if you have a scope, take a scope and look in the lock, check it out, make sure all of the tumblers are working okay. And then you want to count them. Most of these wafer locks, these small wafer locks that are used for cam locks, have 5, but some have 4 wafers, and you might find some small ones even that have 3 wafers, but you can go in there and count them. Okay, so we're going to count the wafers in the lock. I'm going to use the probe on the scope, go in and pick all the wafers up, and as I pull the probe back, we'll listen for the wafers to drop down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we know there's 5 wafers in this lock. We're going to have 5 cuts on our key. Okay, so we want to get our small keys. We know this is a cam lock. It's going to be one of the smaller keys. And we're going to try to identify which key will work the lock. It'll go into the keyway and pick up all of the wafers. So I know it's not this first key. It's a master lock key. This is not a master lock, an M1 key. So we'll just go through and try. Go through all your small keys and try them until you get one that will work. There can be more than one that will work. Pretty sure that one's not going to fit. Okay, here's one that'll fit. Okay, so this is a Y11. It's a Yale key blank. And more than likely, this lock is set to the Yale disc lock system. Yale has a 5 wafer system with 5 cuts, and that's probably what this lock is set up to. But we'll go through and impression the key and see what we come up with. It is helpful to know the specs on the lock you are working on. This data is taken from the HPC code cards, but you can find it on the internet also. You can see that the Yale locks have a depth increment of 20 thousandths, and probably more than half of all the cam locks you encounter will be set up to this increment. You can see that if you file below 250 thousandths, you would have to go down to at least 230 thousandths for the next cut. Below 230, you'd have to go down to at least 210 thousandths, and so on. You can see that the Corbin locks use a depth increment of 15 thousandths. Chicago and Fort locks use the same increment, but allow for 6 cuts. Illinois and Timberline locks use a depth increment of 20 thousandths, but the shallowest cut is 248 thousandths, not 250. Also, Timberline locks reverse the numbers, so the number 4 cut is the shallowest. National locks use a depth increment of 25 thousandths. When working with these small wafer locks, I knife edge the key blank. And I do that for 2 reasons. One, it's easier to pick the marks up on the key blank. But second, these wafers will bend real easy. And if you put just a regular key in there and start bending with very much force at all, you can bend the wafers and mess the lock up. Now, that's not true with other locks. For example, if we were working on a cam lock or a wafer lock that was in a automobile, most of those have much stronger wafers, and we don't need to knife edge the key blank for that. So it depends on the lock that you're working on. But just know, like on these, this is a cheap lock. Probably could buy this lock for $5 or $6. The wafers in here are not real strong. So we have to be mindful of that. And for that reason, again, I'm going to knife edge the key blank. Okay, so I'm going to 45 off one side of the key, again using this fairly rough flat file to do that, so it'll take it off very quickly. I just turn the key at a 45-degree angle, and then I hold the file flat. That's probably enough on that side. When I turn it over, again, hold the key at a 45-degree angle and file off the other side. Okay, now that's going to be pretty rough because that's a rough file. So I'm going to grab my Pippin file to start with. I'm going to use the Pippin file to smooth that out. I'll smooth the other side some. Then I'm going to get my Swiss file that I talked about, my fine Swiss file. I'm going to smooth it even more. Do that to both sides. I think you can see on camera there we got a pretty good knife edge on that. And when I say knife edge, I really do mean a knife edge. This is as sharp as a knife. So that will get us started in impressioning the key blank. Now, if you want to leave the, if you choose not to knife edge the key blank, and you want to try it without the knife edge, you can try it that way, see which way you like. If you're not going to knife edge though, just take your Swiss file and clean off the top of the key with a few strokes of the file to smooth the key and get the file marks on there so that you can start your impressioning process. So here is somewhat of a close-up of the blade knifed off to 45 degrees on each side, and I'll try to get even a closer picture for you. This is a magnified close-up of the knife edge on the key blank. Now, I definitely recommend that as a beginner at this, you put the key blank in, wiggle the key, take it back out, do that 3 or 4 times, and just look for scratch marks on the key. We're not making impressioning marks, but it may make some scratch marks on there. So put the key in, jiggle it back and forth, take it out 3, 4, 5 times, take your magnifying glass and look at it and see if there are scratch marks on there. Not impression marks, just scratch marks. We haven't tried to impression the key yet. So you have some idea as to what it will look like if it's just scratching the key. And you should do that every time that you're ready to re-impression the key. You're going to put it back in and try to get impression marks. Before you do that, look the key over to see if there are any scratch marks on the key, so that if you make new impression marks, you'll know that they are new and they are impression marks, they're not scratch marks. So that's a good little activity to do to get started. And then after you do it for a while, you're going to recognize impression marks as opposed to scratch marks. So now we're ready to try to get impression marks. So we put the key blank back into the vice grips, and we put the key blank into the lock. We turn it to the right to bind it, and then we rock up and down 5 or 6 times, and turn it to the left. Same thing, rock up and down. Back to the right. Now you want to be careful. You want enough pressure to bind the key blank against the wafers, but these little brass key blanks, you want to make sure that you don't just snap the bows off. You will learn how much pressure to put on there in time, but if you do snap the bow off, just take whatever work you have on your key and transfer it to a new key blank. As I come up on the back of the key blank, I'm trying to get impression marks on the first few cuts, 1, 2, and 3. And then as I bring it down, I'm trying to put pressure on the tip of the key, which will give us possibly impression marks on 3, 4, and 5. So you want to try to go equal pressure both up and down. Then you want to take it out and you want to look for impression marks. You can just roll it back and forth in front of a bright light to start with and see what you can see. I see 2 very good impression marks on this key. You can take your magnifying glass, use your magnifying glass, and look for marks. And then where we have marks, we're going to file those down. I'm going to try to get you now a close-up of what these marks look like. Here we have 2 deep impressions, and we got these deep impressions because we knife edged the key blank, but we have a deep impression in cut number 1 and in cut number 5. Here's a closer view of the impression in cut number 1. And this is a closer view of the impression in cut number 5. This is a magnified close-up of the mark in cut number 5. Okay, so I believe you can see these marks on the key here in the first position and in the 5th position. And we're going to file very lightly to get our cut started in those positions. So again, just using the tip of the file and right on where the impression mark is, do a few file strokes. Keep the file even. We only file going forward and we pick the file up to bring it back. We don't drag it back. We get better file marks that we can impression with like that. So I'm pretty sure that this cut I'm on right now would be number 1. And then right here, I'm pretty sure this will be number 5. And we don't want to take it down too much because these could be number 1 cuts. We don't know. If they're 1 depth or 5 depth, we don't know. So we just take a few thousandths off, and then if it is a 1, we don't go too deep. So I'm going to show you a close-up of what the key looks like before I put it back in the lock. Here you can see the key blank filed in cuts 1 and cuts 5, but also notice in this close-up the bright spots that probably indicate cuts 2, 3, and 4. Now these are really just scratches or rub marks at this point, and it's too early to start filing on these spots here, but more than likely this will be the location of cuts 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so we have our cut started on numbers 1 and number 5. We're going to go ahead and try to get more impression marks. Now before you put the key in, you want to study it with a magnifying glass. Now I've already done that so I can see what kind of marks are on there, but I'm not going to show that like every time. Just know that before I put the key in, I study it with the magnifying glass so I can be sure of which marks are on the key already. But once you've studied the key good, put it in there, turn it to the right, bind it, then rock it up and down. Go to the left. Go back to the right. Back to the left. Then we look and see if we can see any more impression marks. You can see a good impression mark in the second cut, the 4th cut. Those are started to mark, and it looks like there are some impression marks in the cuts that we already made in numbers 1 and 5. So I'm going to get a close-up of that for you. Okay, we have good marks in cuts number 1, 2, 4, and 5. And the impression marks are on the lower edge of the key. It's where they're showing up the best. In cut number 1, you see that shadow on the lower edge of the key. And in cut 5, again, if you look on the lower edge of the key, you see kind of a shadow mark there. Then in cuts 2 and 4, we have impressions right on the top of the knife edge. We can also see a little better mark in cut number 3 when we use magnification on this. And then there's also a little mark that is probably just a scratch mark between cuts 2 and cuts 3. So the marks on 3 are really not good enough to do any filing there yet, but we could file 1, 2, 4, and 5. Okay, here you can see a little better the impression marks in cuts 1, 2, and 4. Okay, notice the little shadow mark on the lower edge of cut number 5. That's our impression mark that we made there. This is a magnified close-up of the mark in cut number 5. Okay, so we have marks in 1, we have marks at 2, 4 is marked, and then there's an impression mark in 5. So we need to take 1 down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and start the second cut, which would be here. We have a mark there. And on the fourth cut, there's a mark. Then the fifth cut, we had an impression mark, so it needs to go deeper. I'm going to make 4 a little cleaner. Two's on there, and like I said, we took 1 down a little bit. Okay, I'm going to show you a close-up of that. Here you can see cuts 1, 2, 4, and 5 have been filed down. And again, we can see that bright spot is pretty much dead even between cuts 2 and 4. And that's probably where we're going to find cut number 3 at. Okay, so I've already studied the key with the magnifying glass, and then we're going to try to get more impression marks. So we're going to turn it to the right, bind it, rock it up and down. To the left. Back to the right. To the left. Let's do it once more. Turn it to the right, bind it, rock it. And you want to make sure the key's all the way in every time. Make sure it doesn't slide out a little bit. Make sure it's all the way in there. Okay, let's see if we have some marks on there. I'm going to use a magnifying glass to start with. Okay, I'm going to just move that back and forth in the light for a minute. Just from doing that, I can see marks on 1, 2, 4, and 5. There may be a little mark where 3 is supposed to be at. We may be able to start the number 3 cut. Number 3 could be a number 1 cut. It hasn't really made much of a mark, but there is a tiny, it's like a tiny mark there. We'll get a better close-up and look at that. But I definitely have marks in 1, 2, 4, and 5. So all of those need to go lower. Okay, here's a close-up showing the mark on the lower side of cut number 1. And then there's a small mark. It almost looks like a scratch mark going across cut number 2. But that is a good impression mark, and it shows that we need to file just a small amount there. Here in cut number 4, you see what looks like a line going basically clear across the cut. Not quite dead center. It's a little forward of dead center. But there's a line that was made there that is a good impression mark. And then on cut number 5, if you look on the lower side, you see a pretty good impression mark on the lower edge of the cut. Here's another close-up showing the mark in cut 5. Okay, so we're going to take all of these down a tiny bit. Again, just using the tip of the file. Okay, here you can see the key blank has been filed in cuts 1, 2, 4, and 5, and we're ready to try again for more impression marks. Okay, so again, I've looked at the key with the magnifying glass to be familiar with which marks are already on the key blank. I'm going to put it in and try to get more impression marks. I'm going to bind to the right and rock. And go to the left. Back to the right. To the left. I'm going to roll that back and forth in front of the light. I can see marks on 4 and 5 already. I can see a good mark on 1. There may be a slight mark on 2 again, but definitely we have marks on 1, 4, and 5. And number 3 has a tiny mark there. Number 3, I'm going to guess, is a number 1 cut. So we're going to go ahead and start that cut, but I'll get you a close-up of this. Okay, here's a close-up showing the mark in cut number 1 on the lower edge of the cut. And there's a small mark on the lower edge of cut 2. There's a small mark on 4. And again, that's on the lower edge of the cut. And also on the lower edge of cut number 5, there's a good mark. So we need to file 1, 2, 4, and 5. This is a closer view of the marks in cuts 1 and 2. And here's a close-up view of the marks in cuts 4 and 5. This is a magnified close-up of the marks in cuts number 4 and 5. The pointer is on space number 4. Now, if we look closely between cuts 2 and cut 4, we can see several scratch marks there. But right in the middle, evenly spaced between cuts 2 and 4, we can be pretty sure that is going to be cut number 3, and we can see a little tiny mark there. So we're going to go ahead and make a few file strokes there and start that cut, because we know the key has to have 5 cuts, so we know that one goes there. Okay, we saw good marks in 1, 4, and 5, and again, just a little mark in number 2. So we're going to take down 1, 4, and 5. I'll do those first. And the number 2 cut was just a slight mark, so we're going to just take a little bit off of that. And the number 3 cut really has not marked, but we know it has to be right pretty even between 2 and 4, don't we? And I'm going to just put a little file mark there. That is probably a number 1 cut. And I'm going to just put a little file mark to just mark that we have all 5 cuts on the key, and we suspect number 3 is a number 1 cut. So I'm going to get a close-up of this. Now I've filed all 5 cuts down, and this is what the key blank looks like. We filed just a little bit on cut number 3. And cut number 3 is probably only a number 1. It could be a number 2. We don't know yet. But more than likely, the number 3 space is a 1 cut. I can tell the key's turning a little further now as I go to bind the key. So anyway, turn to the right. Rock the key up and down. To the left, up and down. Back to the right, the left. Okay, just in front of the light I can see a mark in 1, 4. By rolling it back and forth in the light I can see the impression marks. 2 may have a slight little mark in it again. I'm going to use a magnifying glass. I think 5 has a good mark too, so it looks like really 1, it's the same as before. 1, 4, and 5 have fairly decent marks. 2 has just a tiny little mark there. Number 2 is probably a number 2 cut. And there is a little mark now in the number 3 cut that we started. And my guess is still that number 3 is a number 1 cut. So I'll get a close-up of this. Okay, here's a close-up showing good marks in cuts 1, 4, and 5. And again, all of these marks are on the lower edge of the cuts. This is a magnified close-up of the mark in space number 1. This is a magnified close-up of the marks in space number 4. Okay, 1, 4, and 5 definitely have marks in them, as we can see in the close-up. 2 and 3 are more questionable, and we're going to just leave 2 and 3 alone. We're going to take 1, 4, and 5 down. So we've taken 1, 4, and 5 down. And remember, I thought I saw a tiny little mark in 3, and then I decided it was so slight that we really couldn't do anything with it. I'm going to just clean that up a little bit where the number 3 cut is. We'll just clean it up, a couple of file strokes, and then hopefully if it does make a mark, we're going to be able to see it easier. And this is what the key blank looks like now after having filed all 5 cuts down. Okay, so we're going to try for more impression marks now. And again, I can tell the key is trying to turn more, but it's not wanting to turn all the way yet. So we haven't got the cuts in the right place yet. So turn to the right and bind and rock the key. Remember to try to get equal pressure on both the up and the down rocks. If you rock up, try to get the same pressure as you're getting when you go down. Make sure the key blank is all the way in the lock every time. I think the lock just turned. Okay, we have a working key. We're still going to need to clean it up some, but we have a working key. We need to file, and I can tell by rolling in front of the light, we have real good marks in 1, 4, and 5. And there may be a tiny mark in 2, but basically 1, 4, and 5. So we're going to go ahead and I'll get a close-up of that, and then we'll take those down a few file strokes. But we have a working key right there. Okay, in this close-up, you can see the marks in 1, 4, and 5. So even though the key is working, this indicates that we need to file these cuts just a little more. Okay, this is a little closer view, and you can again see the marks. There are good marks in numbers 1 and 4. And then there just are some little tiny marks on 2 and 3. And we could just touch that with a file a little bit. It wouldn't hurt anything. This is a magnified close-up showing the very small marks in cuts 2 and 3. You can still see a slight mark in space number 4. Here's another view showing cuts 3, 4, and 5. This is a magnified close-up of the very small mark in space number 2. This is a magnified close-up of marks in spaces 4 and 5. Okay, so we had marks in 1, 4, and 5 that we want to take down just a tiny bit. Once you have a working key, you don't want to do much to it. It could stop working. So we'll just clean those up and then we'll try it again. But I'll get a picture of this key. And this is what our key now looks like. Okay, so we'll try the key again. You can see that it works fine. So we have a good key there. Works just fine. That's how you impression the key. But one more thing I want to show you is, see, we have kind of a U shape here in this number 1 cut. And so we need to take our pippin file and maybe flatten the edges out a little bit. You can use a flat file if you don't have a pippin file. But if you start to get one of those deep U cuts in there, you want to flatten the sides out. Otherwise that can go in, and as you know from earlier courses, we call that a hooker. If it goes in and hooks in the lock and won't come back out, it's a hooker. So even if it did work, go in and out, it may not go in and out smoothly. So if you see the deep U cut, go ahead and flatten the sides out. Now if we have a code machine, we could go to our code machine and we could cut the customer a nice key right to the manufacturer specifications. The cuts on this key, I'm pretty sure the 3rd cut is a number 1 cut, because we took almost nothing off the 3rd cut. So the one next to it, number 2, is going to be a 2 cut, and the number 1 cut is a deeper cut, it's going to be a 3, and then 4 and 5 are about the same depth as number 1, so they're going to be 3. So it's going to be 3, 2, 1, 3, 3. And since this key blank is a Y11 key blank, it's a Yale key blank, we can be pretty sure that they're using the Yale disc lock specifications. So if we get our card for the Yale Lock Company for their disc locks, we can cut this key, 3, 2, 1, 3, 3. Okay, so here's the key I cut on the code machine using the Yale wafer lock card, 3, 2, 1, 3, 3. As you can see it works it perfectly. This is the HPC code card for the Yale disc locks, and you see that it indicates that it is for the key blank Y11. Of course, we can get space and depth information off of this same code card. The original Yale disc locks that used the depths 0 through 4. They later went to using 1 through 5. This card shows both sets of numbers. Okay, now if you're having problems with trying to get the key to work, check with your micrometer and see what your cuts are. Maybe you've gone a little bit too far on a cut or not quite far enough. This cut measures 194 thousandths. Well, we know a number 4 would be 190, so it's possible that cut needs to go down a few more thousandths, down to 190 yet, to make that key work. If filing results in deep U-shaped cuts, called hookers, use a pippin file or flat file to bevel the sides of the cut to a more standard slope. Please take just a moment to like the video and also subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.